Cleaning staff use the service elevator. The sentence landed sharp and cold across the marble lobby, loud enough to make 3 executives near the espresso bar glance over with amused smirks before quickly looking away again. Vivian Brooks stopped walking. For half a second, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath beneath the pale Manhattan morning light pouring through the 70-foot glass windows. She slowly turned toward the woman behind the reception desk. Blonde hair pulled tight, diamond earrings, corporate smile already fading into irritation. "Excuse me?" Vivian asked calmly. The receptionist looked her up and down again, eyes lingering on the plain gray coat, the sensible shoes damp from the February rain outside, the small leather bag hanging from her shoulder. Nothing about Vivian looked like a billionaire. Nothing about her looked like the woman whose last name was etched in silver across the wall behind them in letters nearly 6 feet wide. Brooks Global. Deliveries and maintenance staff check in downstairs, the receptionist repeated. Executive access is restricted this morning. Nearby, someone chuckled softly. Vivian glanced toward the sound. 2 white men in tailored navy suits stood near the elevators holding coffees, watching her with the casual curiosity people reserved for someone they had already decided didn't belong. One leaned toward the other and whispered something that made both men smile wider. Vivian felt the familiar pressure settle quietly in her chest. Not anger, not surprise. Something older than that. Something tired. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with polished marble and burnt espresso filled the air around her as employees crossed the lobby in quick waves of motion, heels clicking, phones ringing, elevator bells chiming every few seconds. Nobody noticed the woman standing beneath the company logo except to avoid eye contact with her. Vivian reached into her coat pocket and checked the time. 7:54 a.m. Exactly 6 minutes before the emergency board meeting. The receptionist sighed impatiently. "Ma'am, if you're here to clean or deliver food, you need another entrance." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Then, her eyes drifted upward toward the towering glass ceiling reflecting the gray New York sky. 22 years ago, her father used to mop these exact floors during overnight shifts while she waited in the janitor's closet doing homework beside a flickering utility light. Back then the building had smelled like bleach and old carpet instead of imported orchids and luxury perfume. She could still hear his voice sometimes. Never let a building convince you who matters inside it. The memory passed quickly. Vivian looked back at the receptionist and smiled faintly. "I'm expected upstairs," she said. "Name?" "Vivian Brooks." The receptionist typed lazily for less than 2 seconds before shaking her head. "Nope, nothing here." One of the executives near the elevator laughed under his breath. "That's creative, though." Another elevator opened with a soft ding. More executives stepped out onto the polished marble floor, expensive coats folded over their arms, conversation flowing easily until several noticed Vivian standing there. Their expressions shifted almost instantly. Confusion first, then dismissal, then the subtle discomfort wealthy people wore when forced to acknowledge someone they considered beneath them. Vivian stayed perfectly still beneath the silver letters on the wall as rainwater slid slowly from the edge of her coat sleeve onto the marble floor below. Then a quiet voice suddenly came from behind her. "Miss Vivian?" She turned. An older black janitor stood frozen near the service hallway, his mop bucket beside him, eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus Reed had worked in this building almost as long as her father had. His hands trembled slightly around the mop handle as recognition spread slowly across his face. And at that exact moment, the executive elevators opened again. The executive elevator doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop instantly. Daniel Whitmore stepped out first, silver tie perfectly straight, dark wool coat folded neatly over one arm, phone pressed against his ear as 2 younger executives followed closely behind him carrying tablets and folders. Nobody interrupted him when he walked through the building. Nobody even breathed too loudly around him. That was the culture now at Brooks Global. Controlled, polished, intimidating. Daniel ended the call without looking up. If the Tokyo numbers are not fixed before market open, somebody loses a job today. The younger executives nodded quickly. Then Daniel finally noticed the silence around the reception desk. His eyes shifted toward Vivian. He paused for barely half a second before continuing forward again. "Problem?" he asked flatly. The receptionist straightened immediately. This woman says she belongs upstairs. One of the younger executives smirked before taking a sip of coffee. Daniel barely glanced at Vivian. Human resources interviews are on Thursdays. A few people nearby laughed quietly. Marcus tightened his grip around the mop handle so hard his knuckles turned pale. Vivian remained still beneath the massive silver company logo reflecting morning light across the marble floor. Daniel finally looked directly at her now, but not with recognition. Only annoyance. "You cannot stand here blocking executive traffic," he said. "Security will escort you downstairs if necessary." Vivian studied him carefully. 8 months. That was how long she had been away from the company after disappearing from public life during treatment and recovery while Daniel operated as interim chief executive. Long enough for people to grow comfortable. Long enough for people to forget whose name was on the building. Long enough for fear to replace respect. Daniel checked his watch impatiently. "We have a board meeting in 5 minutes. Vivian glanced at the watch on her own wrist. Her father had bought it secondhand 30 years ago from a pawn shop in Queens after saving overtime money for almost 4 months. The leather strap had been replaced twice, but she still wore it every day. "Actually," she said softly, "you have 4. Daniel let out a short, dry laugh. Confident. Behind him, one of the executives leaned toward another and whispered, "Probably another social media stunt." Vivian heard it. She heard everything. The polished shoes slowing nearby. The receptionist typing nervously now. The distant ringing of elevator bells. The quiet scrape of Marcus pushing the mop bucket a few inches closer like he was ready to step between her and the entire building if he had to. Daniel turned slightly toward the receptionist. "Why is she still here?" Before the woman could answer, Marcus suddenly spoke. "Sir." His voice came out rough and uncertain. Daniel looked irritated already. "What?" Marcus swallowed hard. "I think maybe you should look again." Daniel frowned. "At what?" Marcus glanced toward Vivian, emotion flickering visibly across his face now. "At her." For the first time, Daniel actually paused long enough to study Vivian properly. The gray coat. The calm posture. The eyes that did not lower beneath pressure. Something shifted faintly across his expression, but only for an instant. Then his face hardened again. "I do not know who you think you are," he said coldly. "But this floor is restricted." Vivian stepped closer to the reception desk. The marble reflected faint shadows beneath her shoes as rain tapped softly against the towering windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. "Can you do me a favor?" she asked quietly. Daniel crossed his arms. "No." Vivian looked directly at the receptionist instead. "Please call the boardroom upstairs and tell them Vivian Brooks is waiting in the lobby." The silence that followed felt enormous. One executive laughed first, then another. The receptionist actually smiled now, relieved to think she understood the joke. Daniel shook his head slowly like a teacher exhausted by a difficult student. "Enough." He motioned toward a security guard near the elevators. "Remove her from the floor." And that was when every television screen in the lobby suddenly flickered black. Every television screen in the lobby turned black at the exact same moment. The laughter stopped instantly. Elevator bells continued chiming somewhere behind them. But now even those sounded distant beneath the sudden silence spreading across the marble floor. Daniel Whitmore frowned and looked upward as the massive 80-inch display above reception flickered once before the Brooks Global logo appeared in sharp silver against a dark background. Then came the voice. "Good morning, board members and executive staff." Calm. Female. Familiar. Several executives immediately straightened. The receptionist blinked in confusion. Security slowed to a stop only a few feet from Vivian now, uncertain whether to continue. The voice continued. "Due to this morning's emergency shareholder review, attendance is mandatory." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "What is this?" one executive whispered. Vivian said nothing. Rain slid softly down the towering glass windows overlooking Lexington Avenue, while the reflection of the television screens shimmered across the polished marble beneath everyone's feet. Then the screen changed again. A live video feed appeared from the executive boardroom upstairs. 12 board members sat around the long walnut conference table in complete silence. At the center sat Eleanor Bishop, chairwoman of Brooks Global for nearly 20 years. Her silver-framed glasses rested low against her nose as she glanced down at a document in front of her before speaking again. "Before we begin today's vote, we would like to formally welcome back the founder and majority owner of Brooks Global." The receptionist's face drained of color instantly. Daniel stopped breathing for half a second. Beside the service hallway, Marcus lowered his eyes slowly like a man watching a storm finally arrive after years of waiting. Eleanor looked directly into the camera. Miss Vivian Brooks. The lobby froze. Truly froze. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Phones lowered slowly. One executive near the elevator accidentally dropped his tablet onto the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the room like breaking glass. Daniel turned toward Vivian fully now. Really looked at her for the first time all morning. The plain gray coat suddenly looked different. The calm expression looked different. Even the old watch on her wrist somehow carried weight now beneath the cold white lobby lights. The receptionist stepped backward, so quickly her chair rolled into the desk behind her. "Oh my God," she whispered. Vivian remained completely still. "No," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. "No, this is not possible." On screen, Eleanor continued speaking. Miss Brooks requested a complete internal review after receiving reports concerning executive misconduct, discrimination complaints, and abuse of authority during her medical leave. Several executives exchanged nervous looks immediately. One man near the elevators removed his company badge entirely, like it had suddenly become dangerous to wear. Daniel's voice returned sharply now, desperate to regain control. "Vivian, if this is some misunderstanding, a misunderstanding?" Vivian finally interrupted. Her voice stayed soft, but somehow it cut through the entire lobby more cleanly than shouting ever could. Daniel swallowed hard. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked at him anymore. They were all looking at her now. The woman they had mistaken for cleaning staff less than 2 minutes earlier. Vivian slowly stepped toward the center of the lobby beneath the enormous silver letters of Brooks Global shining above her head. Her shoes echoed lightly against the marble with each step. Calm, measured, unhurried. 6 minutes, she said quietly. That is how long I stood in my own building before someone decided I deserved basic respect. The words landed harder than anger, harder than humiliation. Around the lobby, employees avoided eye contact now. The receptionist looked close to tears. Security quietly stepped backward toward the wall. Daniel tried again. "Vivian, I can explain." She turned toward him slowly. "That is the problem," she replied. "You think this started today." Silence swallowed the room again. Then upstairs on the screen, Eleanor Bishop adjusted her glasses once more before opening a thick black folder in front of her. "Miss Brooks," she said carefully, "the board is prepared to proceed whenever you are." Vivian looked toward the screen, then toward Marcus standing silently beside the service hallway with tears gathering quietly in his tired eyes. And for the first time that morning, Vivian smiled. The smile on Vivian Brooks's face was not triumphant. That was what unsettled everyone the most. She did not look angry enough for revenge or emotional enough for drama. She looked calm, certain, like someone finally confirming what she already knew. The giant television screens continued glowing above the lobby while employees gathered quietly along the edges of the marble floor, pretending to check phones while listening to every word. Outside the windows, yellow taxis crawled through rainy Manhattan traffic 30 stories below, but inside Brooks Global, the entire building felt suspended in place. Daniel Whitmore cleared his throat and stepped forward carefully, forcing confidence back into his posture. "Vivian," he said, lowering his voice now. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. "Privately," she repeated softly. Daniel nodded quickly. "There are procedures for situations like this." A faint murmur moved through the lobby. Vivian glanced upward toward the screens where the board members still waited in complete silence. Then her eyes drifted slowly back toward Daniel. "You had procedures this morning too," she said. "You just forgot to use them on me." The words landed like cold rain. Daniel's jaw tightened. Near the elevators, one executive quietly loosened his tie, while another subtly tried to step backward toward the hallway without attracting attention. Nobody wanted to stand too close to Daniel anymore. Not now. The receptionist lowered her eyes completely, unable to look at Vivian after replaying the last 6 minutes in her head over and over again. Vivian turned toward Marcus instead. "How long have you worked here now?" Marcus blinked, surprised she had spoken directly to him. 31 years, Miss Vivian." His voice cracked slightly on her name. Vivian nodded slowly. "Longer than most of the executives upstairs." A few uncomfortable glances shifted around the room immediately. Marcus looked down at the worn gray handle of his mop bucket. Your father was proud of this company, he said quietly, even when it stopped being proud of people like him. Silence followed that sentence. Deep silence. Daniel looked irritated again now, but beneath the irritation sat something newer. Fear. Real fear. Vivian heard it in the way his breathing shortened. Saw it in how tightly he folded his coat against his arm. He was beginning to understand that this was no longer about embarrassment. This was about exposure. Upstairs on the screen, Eleanor Bishop finally spoke again. Miss Brooks, before the vote begins, there is one additional matter requiring your authorization. Vivian looked up. Eleanor opened another folder slowly. During your absence, multiple complaints were submitted regarding discriminatory hiring practices, executive misconduct, and retaliatory terminations. Daniel immediately interrupted. Those accusations were never substantiated. Eleanor did not even acknowledge him. Several employees resigned after reporting hostile treatment toward support staff, custodians, and administrative workers. Vivian's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened faintly around the old leather strap of her father's watch. Daniel stepped closer now, desperation beginning to bleed through his polished executive calm. Vivian, you left me in charge during an impossible year. Markets crashed. Investors panicked. I kept this company alive. Vivian finally faced him completely. Alive? She asked softly. Or profitable? Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came. The lobby lights reflected sharply against the marble floor between them, while rain streaked silver across the windows behind Vivian, like lines of watercolors running down glass. She took one slow step forward. My father cleaned this building for 22 years, she said. Do you know what he used to tell me? Nobody spoke. He said you can measure a company by how it treats the people nobody notices. The receptionist quietly wiped tears from beneath her eyes now. Even the security guards looked uncomfortable standing there. Vivian glanced around the lobby slowly. The frightened assistants. The silent janitors. The executives pretending not to shake. Then she looked back toward the giant screen upstairs where the board waited for her decision. Eleanor folded her hands carefully atop the conference table. Miss Brooks, she said gently, shall we proceed with the executive review? Vivian exhaled slowly through her nose. Calm. Controlled. Final. Then she answered with 5 words that made the entire lobby freeze all over. Again. Start with Daniel Whitmore first. The air inside the lobby changed the moment Vivian Brooks spoke Daniel Whitmore's name. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of calm certainty that made powerful people suddenly aware of their own breathing. Daniel stood motionless beneath the white lobby lights while the giant television screens continued broadcasting the boardroom upstairs in perfect silence. Outside the windows, rain rolled slowly down the glass in silver streaks, blurring the skyline beyond Manhattan into cold watercolor shadows. Eleanor Bishop adjusted the papers in front of her carefully. For the record, she began, the board has completed a preliminary review of executive conduct during Miss Brooks's absence. Daniel immediately stepped forward. This is inappropriate. His voice sounded sharper now, less controlled. You cannot hold a disciplinary hearing in the middle of the lobby. Vivian looked toward him calmly. Interesting, she said softly. You had no problem humiliating someone in the middle of this lobby 10 minutes ago. Several employees lowered their eyes instantly. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor continued speaking over him. Under interim leadership, Brooks Global approved 32 executive bonuses while simultaneously reducing janitorial staffing, administrative support, and employee assistance funding. Marcus looked down quietly beside his mop bucket. Vivian did not move. Additionally, Eleanor said, multiple discrimination complaints were closed internally without investigation. One executive near the elevators suddenly whispered, "Oh my God." Another quietly stepped away from Daniel altogether. The distance between them widened almost visibly across the marble floor. Daniel forced a strained smile now. Vivian, every decision made during your leave was to stabilize the company. Vivian glanced slowly around the lobby. The frightened receptionist, the silent assistants, the security guards pretending not to listen. Then she looked back at Daniel. Stable companies do not teach employees to look down on people, she replied. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. You are making this emotional. Vivian almost smiled at that. Almost. No, she said quietly. You only think dignity is emotional because you never had to fight for it. The silence afterward felt enormous. Somewhere near the elevators, a coffee machine hissed softly. Nobody moved. Nobody checked phones anymore. Upstairs, Eleanor opened another file. 3 employees specifically reported retaliation after raising concerns regarding discriminatory treatment towards support staff. Daniel's face darkened. Anonymous accusations. No, Eleanor corrected calmly. Signed statements. The giant screen shifted suddenly, displaying internal security footage from earlier that morning. The lobby appeared from above in grainy black and white. Vivian standing quietly near reception. The receptionist dismissing her. Executives laughing nearby. Daniel signaling security. The room watched itself become evidence. Daniel stared upward at the screen in disbelief. Vivian remained perfectly still while her own humiliation replayed above her head for the entire company to witness. Marcus looked away entirely now, unable to watch. Turn that off, Daniel snapped. Nobody moved. The footage continued. Clear. Undeniable. One assistant covered her mouth quietly, as if only now realizing how cruel the scene looked from the outside. Another executive slowly removed his Brooks Global lapel pin and slipped it into his pocket. Daniel looked toward Vivian again, but now the confidence was gone. Completely gone. You planned this, he said quietly. Vivian tilted her head slightly. No, she replied. You planned this. Daniel frowned. Vivian gestured lightly toward the television screen above them. I arrived wearing a gray coat. You decided what that meant. The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel's shoulders sagged almost invisibly for the first time all morning. Upstairs, Eleanor folded her hands again. The board has unanimously approved immediate executive review proceedings. The receptionist quietly began crying now, mascara smudging beneath one eye. Vivian noticed and softened slightly when she looked at her. You do not need to cry, she said gently. You just became part of a culture somebody else created. Daniel looked stunned by that kindness more than anything else. Vivian could have humiliated her, could have destroyed her publicly. Instead, she sounded tired, deeply tired. Marcus finally spoke again, voice rough with emotion. Your father used to say people reveal themselves fastest when they think nobody important is watching. Vivian lowered her eyes briefly at the mention of him. Then she looked back toward the boardroom screen upstairs. Eleanor nodded once. Miss Brooks, she said carefully. The board is ready for your final recommendation regarding executive leadership. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass while the entire lobby waited for Vivian Brooks to decide who still belonged inside the company, carrying her family name. No one spoke after Eleanor Bishop asked for Vivian Brooks's final recommendation. The silence settled slowly across the lobby like snowfall, soft but heavy enough to change everything underneath it. Rain continued sliding down the massive glass windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan, while pale morning light reflected across the marble floor in long silver streaks. Vivian stood motionless beneath the company logo carrying her family name, her father's old watch resting against her wrist like a quiet heartbeat from another lifetime. Daniel Whitmore looked smaller now somehow. Not physically, spiritually. The confidence that once filled every room before him had drained away piece by piece until all that remained was a tired man in an expensive suit standing inside consequences he never believed would reach him. Vivian looked toward Marcus first. The old janitor still stood near the service hallway with both hands resting on the mop handle, eyes lowered respectfully the same way he had done for executives his entire career. But his shoulders trembled slightly now. Vivian noticed. Marcus, she said softly. He looked up immediately. Yes, Miss Vivian. Her expression gentled. How old was I when you taught me how to wax these floors? A faint laugh escaped Marcus despite everything. Maybe 10 years old. Vivian nodded slowly. You said if somebody cannot see their own reflection in the floor, then the job was not finished. Marcus smiled through wet eyes. Your father used to say that. For a moment, the tension inside the lobby loosened slightly. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. The reception desk lights glowed softly against polished stone while elevator bells echoed faintly through distant hallways above them. Vivian turned slowly toward the giant windows. Far below, tiny yellow taxis crawled through rain-soaked streets, while people hurried beneath umbrellas without realizing an entire company was changing overhead. When I was little, Vivian said quietly, my father used to bring me here during night shifts because he could not afford childcare. Nobody interrupted her. Even the boardroom upstairs remained completely silent on the screens. I remember sleeping inside supply closets wrapped in winter coats while he worked double shifts polishing floors nobody important ever noticed. Daniel lowered his eyes. Vivian continued watching the rain beyond the glass. Every morning before sunrise, executives walked through this lobby carrying coffee and leather briefcases while my father disappeared into service hallways before anyone saw him. Marcus wiped one eye quickly with the back of his hand. But he loved this building anyway, Vivian whispered. Because he believed hard work meant something. Her voice never cracked. That made it harder to listen to somehow. The problem is not that people forgot my face, she continued softly. The problem is that they forgot his. The words settled deep into the room. One assistant quietly removed her glasses to wipe tears beneath them. Even the security guards stared at the floor now, uncomfortable with how human the morning had suddenly become. Vivian finally turned back toward Daniel. He looked exhausted standing there beneath the white lobby lights. Do you know what hurts most? She asked him gently. Daniel swallowed hard, but said nothing. Vivian stepped closer. You looked at me and saw inconvenience before humanity. Daniel's breathing slowed unevenly. Vivian, he said quietly, I made mistakes. She nodded once. Yes. Nothing more. Just yes. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled faintly beyond the skyscrapers while the rain against the glass softened into tiny rhythmic taps. Vivian glanced toward the reception desk where the young receptionist still stood frozen with swollen eyes and trembling hands. What is your name? Vivian asked softly. Claire, the woman whispered. Vivian nodded. Claire, I am not angry that you did not recognize me. Claire looked confused for a second. Vivian continued. I am angry that kindness in this building became something people thought had to be earned. Silence again. Deep silence. The kind people remembered years later. Upstairs on the television screen, Eleanor Bishop closed the black folder in front of her carefully. Miss Brooks, she said quietly, the board is awaiting your decision. Vivian looked once more toward the rain-covered skyline beyond the windows. Then she looked at Marcus. Then Daniel. Then the frightened employees standing around the lobby wondering whether mercy still existed inside powerful places. And finally, Vivian Brooks spoke. Vivian Brooks let the silence breathe for several seconds before answering the board. Nobody moved inside the lobby. Nobody even dared whisper anymore. Rain continued tapping softly against the towering windows while pale morning light washed silver across the marble floors her father once polished through overnight shifts nobody remembered except the people who worked beside him. Vivian looked toward Eleanor Bishop on the screen upstairs. My decision, she said quietly, is not based on anger. Daniel Whitmore closed his eyes briefly like a man hoping those words might save him. Vivian continued. Anger disappears too quickly. Culture stays. The sentence settled over the room with slow, devastating weight. Eleanor folded her hands carefully. Understood. Vivian stepped forward another few inches beneath the enormous company logo hanging above the lobby like a monument to everything her father believed hard work could build. Effective immediately, she said calmly. Daniel Whitmore is removed as interim chief executive officer of Brooks Global. Nobody reacted at first. The words almost seemed too heavy to process. Then came the sound. A quiet gasp near the elevators. Someone dropping a pen. The receptionist covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Daniel stared at Vivian as if the world beneath him had shifted sideways. Vivian, he said softly, please. Not commanding now. Pleading. Vivian held his gaze. You taught this company that appearances mattered more than people, she replied. And everyone followed your example because fear is easier than integrity. Daniel looked around the lobby desperately, but nobody stepped toward him anymore. Not the executives who laughed beside him earlier. Not the assistants who rushed behind him every morning. Even the security guards had unconsciously drifted farther away. Power was leaving him in real time, and everybody could feel it happening. Upstairs on the screen, Eleanor nodded toward another board member who slid several folders across the conference table. The board has also approved termination proceedings for 7 executives connected to the complaints under review. One executive near the back whispered a curse beneath his breath. Another immediately began typing furiously on his phone, probably calling attorneys. Vivian barely looked at them. Her attention drifted instead toward Claire behind the reception desk. The young woman still looked devastated, mascara faintly streaked beneath tired eyes. Vivian walked toward her slowly. Her shoes echoed softly against the marble. Claire lowered her head immediately. "I am so sorry," she whispered shakily. Vivian stopped beside the desk. "Look at me." Claire hesitated before slowly lifting her eyes. Vivian's expression remained calm. Tired, but calm. "You judged me before speaking to me," Vivian said gently. Claire nodded through tears. "Yes. But you are not the only person in this building who learned that behavior from leadership." Claire swallowed hard. Vivian glanced briefly toward Daniel, standing isolated near the elevators. "Fear travels downward," she said quietly. "So does dignity." Claire's breathing shook slightly as she listened. Vivian reached down and picked up the visitor badge still lying on the reception desk. The cheap plastic reflected pale light across her fingers. She stared at it for a moment before placing it back down carefully. "Keep your job," she told Claire softly. The receptionist blinked in disbelief. "What?" Vivian looked directly at her. But things changed starting today. Across the lobby, Marcus lowered his eyes again, overcome with emotion. Vivian noticed him and smiled faintly. "Marcus Reed." He straightened immediately. "Yes, Miss Vivian. I would like you upstairs for the executive meeting." Marcus froze completely. "Me?" Several executives looked shocked by the idea alone. Vivian nodded. "You have seen this company more clearly than most people in suits." Marcus's weathered hands trembled around the mop handle. For 31 years, he had entered through service doors before sunrise so executives would not have to see him pushing cleaning carts through polished hallways. And now every eye in the lobby had turned toward him. Daniel looked stunned watching it happen. Vivian finally faced him one last time. "My father once told me something," she said quietly. "He said powerful people reveal themselves fastest when they think the person in front of them cannot change their lives." Daniel lowered his eyes. Vivian's voice softened even more. "This morning, you proved him right." Then the executive elevators opened behind her with a soft mechanical hum, and for the first time all morning, they were waiting for Vivian Brooks. The executive elevators remained open behind Vivian Brooks, warm light spilling softly across the marble floor, while nobody inside the lobby seemed ready to move again. Daniel Whitmore stood frozen near the reception desk, his coat still folded over one arm, even though his hand now trembled faintly against the fabric. Around him, the atmosphere had completely changed. 30 minutes earlier, executives had laughed beside him. Assistants rushed to open doors for him. Security reacted the second he lifted a finger. Now people avoided standing too close to him, as if power itself had become contagious on the way down. Vivian looked toward Marcus first. "Come with me," she said gently. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Miss Vivian, I do not belong in executive meetings." Vivian's expression softened. "Neither did my father," she replied quietly. That never stopped him from understanding this company better than anyone else. Marcus lowered his eyes immediately, overwhelmed. The old fluorescent lights above the service hallway reflected faintly against the silver streaks in his graying hair, while the mop bucket beside him sat forgotten for the first time in decades. Vivian stepped toward the elevator, but before she entered, Daniel finally spoke again. "Please." The word came out rough. Human. Not polished anymore. Vivian paused without turning around. Daniel swallowed hard beneath the eyes of the entire lobby. "I know how this looks." Vivian almost smiled sadly at that sentence. Slowly, she turned back toward him. "Do you?" she asked softly. Daniel glanced around the room now, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The frightened receptionist. The silent janitors. The assistants pretending not to cry. The executives who suddenly found their phones very interesting. The people he overlooked every day were no longer invisible because Vivian had forced everyone to see them, including him. Daniel exhaled shakily. "I thought strength meant control," he admitted quietly. "I thought leaders had to stay above everyone." Vivian studied him carefully. The rain outside had softened now into a gray mist drifting across the skyline, while weak morning sunlight pushed gently through the clouds and spread pale gold reflections across the lobby floor. "And now?" she asked. Daniel looked toward Marcus, toward Claire behind the reception desk. toward the security guards standing silently beside the elevators. Finally, he lowered his eyes. Now I think I forgot how to see people. The honesty in his voice startled the room. Vivian remained still for several seconds. Then she stepped closer to him again, calm as ever. Power does that when nobody challenges it, she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. Small, defeated, human. Upstairs on the giant television screens, the board members watched silently without interrupting. Even Eleanor Bishop looked thoughtful now, fingers folded together atop the conference table. Vivian glanced briefly toward the executives still standing near the elevators. Expensive suits, nervous faces, men and women who built entire careers around learning which people mattered and which people did not. Brooks Global will survive losing executives, Vivian said softly. But it would not survive losing its humanity. The words settled heavily through the lobby. Claire wiped tears from beneath her eyes again. One assistant near the hallway quietly removed her high heels and carried them in one hand after standing frozen for almost an hour. Small human moments returning slowly to the room. Vivian looked toward Daniel one final time. I am removing you because leadership without dignity becomes poison. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I understand. And for the first time all morning, Vivian believed he actually did. She nodded once toward security. Mr. Whitmore is to leave with full severance and private escort. No humiliation. No spectacle. Several people looked surprised by that mercy. Daniel looked most surprised of all. Vivian's voice stayed calm. Nobody learns compassion from cruelty. Silence followed her words. Deep and reflective. Marcus looked at Vivian with something close to awe now. Not because she had power. Because she refused to use it the way others had. Daniel slowly straightened his tie one last time before giving Vivian a small nod filled with quiet shame and gratitude all at once. Then he turned and walked toward the elevators without another word. The marble floor echoed softly beneath his footsteps until the elevator doors finally closed around him. Vivian watched the silver doors seal shut. Then she looked toward Marcus. Ready? She asked gently. Marcus smiled through tired eyes. For the first time in 31 years, he whispered, yes. And together, they stepped into the executive elevator while the entire lobby stood silently watching the company become something different. The executive elevator rose quietly through the center of Brooks Global while rain drifted across the windows outside in soft gray waves. Vivian Brooks stood beside Marcus Reed in complete silence as floor numbers glowed one by one above the polished steel doors. 36. 37, 38. Marcus still held the old mop handle in one hand because he had forgotten to leave it downstairs. Vivian noticed and smiled faintly. You can let go of it now, she said gently. Marcus looked embarrassed for a second before carefully setting the mop against the corner of the elevator wall. Sorry, he whispered. Habit. Vivian nodded slowly. My father used to carry his work gloves home even on Sundays. Marcus laughed softly through his nose. That sounds like him. The elevator continued climbing. Warm golden light reflected against the brushed steel walls while the city skyline slowly expanded outside the glass behind them. Down below, Manhattan looked small now. Tiny headlights moving through wet streets. Tiny umbrellas crossing intersections. Tiny people rushing through another ordinary morning while an entire company quietly changed above them. When the elevator doors finally opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere felt completely different from downstairs. The carpets muted every footstep. Walls of dark walnut and glass stretched across long silent hallways overlooking the city. Assistants stood frozen beside conference room doors as Vivian stepped out first. Several lowered their heads respectfully the moment they saw her. Marcus hesitated before following behind her carefully, uncomfortable walking through spaces he had spent decades cleaning after hours but never entering during daylight. Vivian noticed immediately. Walk beside me, she said softly. Marcus blinked. Miss Vivian, I should stay behind. Vivian stopped walking and looked at him fully. No, she replied gently. Not anymore. Something shifted in Marcus's face then. Something old. Years of invisibility loosening all at once. He moved beside her slowly. Together they walked down the executive hallway while floor-to-ceiling windows reflected pale, morning light across polished wood and glass. Inside the boardroom, 12 board members rose to their feet the moment Vivian entered. Eleanor Bishop stepped forward first. Welcome home, she said quietly. Vivian nodded once. Thank you. Then she looked toward the empty chair at the far end of the table where her father used to leave handwritten notes whenever he cleaned the room overnight. She could almost still picture him there carrying a coffee cup in one hand and a rag over his shoulder while humming old jazz songs beneath his breath. Marcus noticed where she was looking. He loved this room, he whispered softly. Vivian